Not too long ago, I embarked on my typical Target expedition, armed with a disabled parking placard, my trusty companion for navigating the store's labyrinthine aisles. As I pulled into the parking lot, my heart sank as I noticed that all the designated parking spaces were occupied. To add insult to injury, someone had parked their hulking Escalade with an arrogant disregard for the lines, effectively claiming both disabled spaces as their own. I could feel the familiar irritation building up inside me. This situation was all too common, an infuriating testament to the entitlement that seemed to run rampant in the area. Taking a deep breath, I decided to take action. After all, I had dealt with this kind of inconsiderate behavior one too many times. With a resolve that only someone who has grown weary of such injustice can muster, I walked around the offending vehicle. My eyes scanned for any sign of a disabled parking placard or a license plate that might justify this egregious act. There was nothing, no indicator whatsoever that this Escalade had any right to be in those precious spots. Fueled by righteous indignation, I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of the offending vehicle. The time had come to seek justice. Determined, I marched into the store, navigating the sea of red shopping carts and fluorescent lights until I found a manager. The manager, a seasoned veteran who had clearly dealt with similar situations countless times before, listened as I presented the incriminating photo. She sighed and rolled her eyes in response, the weariness of countless similar incidents etched into her expression. This Target store was located in close proximity to an affluent town known for its abundance of wealthy, entitled residents, and it seemed that the owners of massive SUVs and F-150s often led the charge in parking transgressions. The manager assured me that she would take action and promptly picked up the phone to call the police. Deciding to keep a vigilant eye on the unfolding drama, I headed back outside and stationed myself by the store's entrance, preparing for the showdown that was about to take place. To my surprise, the manager soon joined me, and we struck up a conversation while awaiting the arrival of law enforcement. It was clear that she had seen it all in her tenure at this Target location. Moments later, the flashing lights of police cruisers punctuated the scene as officers arrived to assess the situation. With measured steps, they approached the illegally parked Escalade, their expressions conveying a blend of duty and exasperation. They circled the vehicle, peering through its windows, and ran the license plate through their system. One of the officers retrieved a small notebook, a harbinger of trouble for the Escalade's owner. As the police conducted their investigation, one of the officers signaled for an announcement to be made over the store's PA system, a final attempt to summon the driver of the Escalade. Inside, a disembodied voice echoed through the aisles, broadcasting the make, model, and license plate of the offending vehicle. And then, like a tempestuous force of nature, she emerged from the store, a middle-aged woman, immaculately dressed, the quintessential Karen of North America. Her arrival was accompanied by a cacophony of raised voices, as she immediately launched into a tirade directed at the police officers. However, one of the officers swiftly raised his hand, silencing her fiery protests. He began to lecture her firmly and assertively, though I was too far away to catch the specifics of their conversation. Nevertheless, the dressing down had the desired effect, as she ceased her outbursts and listened to the officer attentively. After a few minutes of what appeared to be a stern lecture, the other officer handed her 2 official documents. Her face contorted with anger, shock, and disbelief. As the police wrapped up their business, they returned to the manager and me, conveying the details of their actions. They had ordered the woman to move her vehicle immediately, and if she failed to comply or caused further disruption inside the store, they promised to return and have her car towed. Furthermore, they had slapped her with 2 hefty citations, each carrying a $500 fine for the blatant violation of 2 parking spaces. The sting of justice was palpable. With a final word of gratitude, the police officers headed back to their cruisers. The woman, still seething with indignation, reluctantly returned to her Escalade. She revved the engine and peeled out of the parking lot in a hasty retreat, her day taking an unexpected turn for the worse. The 2 officers exchanged knowing glances before starting their own vehicles and following her. It was clear they intended to ensure that her day continued to align with the consequences of her actions. As I watched them depart, a sense of vindication washed over me. The day had unfolded as it should, with justice served, and the memory of this encounter would serve as a satisfying reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, those who disregard the rights of others receive their due comeuppance.
As a dedicated seamstress, my life had taken a significant turn when I secured a job in a bustling sewing shop. It was the opportunity one had longed for, a chance to nurture my passion for sewing and contribute to a thriving business. However, with this newfound career came certain rules and restrictions, one of which strictly prohibited me from pursuing freelance sewing jobs on the side. It was a condition I was more than willing to accept, for my dream job was far too precious to jeopardize. Life was going well until one day, a good friend reached out to me with a request for an alteration. Her son, a grown man, needed a new zipper for his jacket, a task I was well versed in, thanks to my job. I explained this situation to my friend, emphasizing that I couldn't offer my services from my living room anymore. Instead, I suggested that her son visit the shop for an estimate, assuring her that we'd take good care of him. True to my word, the young man arrived at the shop, where my boss personally quoted him a price. The exact words were, "Like we discussed the other day, this would be $35 plus $5 to $8 for the new zipper." However, it was essential to clarify that this was no ordinary jacket. It was a robust Carhartt winter work coat. Replacing the zipper on such a garment was a far cry from the 20-minute task of altering a pullover hoodie into a zip-up. Even if I were still freelancing, I would have charged at least $50 for such a job. Thus, $35 was an exceptionally reasonable price. Unbeknownst to me, this was not the first time the young man had visited our shop. He had already received the same quote days earlier, which apparently had caused him to become disgruntled. In his frustration, he contacted his mother, my friend, hoping to get a better deal due to our personal connection. Yet, when he heard that the price remained unchanged, he unleashed a barrage of complaints. $35 for a zipper is outrageous. My mom could do it so much cheaper. I can't believe you'd charge that much for just a zipper. His tone was impolite, and his words were filled with ingratitude. I watched in disbelief as he stormed out, leaving the shop staff and me in a state of bemusement. We exchanged glances and shared a collective sigh. It was undeniably an embarrassing display. My anger, however, began to brew beneath the surface. How could he have the audacity to come into my workplace, expecting special treatment after having his mom intervene on his behalf? It was unacceptable. I knew I had to do something about it. Determined to set things right, I called his mother back, providing her with a detailed account of the events that had transpired. I made sure she understood precisely what her son had been told and how he had treated us. Her response was firm and filled with disappointment. She assured me that her son would not escape her wrath. She emphasized, "I did not raise him to be such a butthole, and that behavior is unacceptably rude. Don't even worry about him. I'm going to handle it." With years of friendship between us, I had no doubt that she would make good on her promise to give him a come-to-Jesus talk he would not soon forget. As I hung up the phone, a sense of satisfaction washed over me. I hoped that her son was enjoying the reprimand he so richly deserved from his parents. I eagerly anticipated the moment when he would inevitably come crawling back to apologize after discovering that his mother would not be hand-sewing that zipper for him. Furthermore, he would soon realize that the few other places in town offering alterations charged a significantly higher fee than our shop. Justice had prevailed, and I had no doubt that this experience would serve as a valuable lesson for the young man.
About 2 years ago, I found myself in an IT role that was both challenging and frustrating, and I wanted to share my story. It could easily fit into the category of malicious compliance, and it's a true story that I consider equitable. I was transitioning from being a semi-cloud engineer to working on a help desk for about 4 months, and I was tasked with setting up a social work system for use within our local area. For those unfamiliar with IT, there's often a lack of knowledge sharing, leading to individuals specializing in very specific tasks. This can result in points of failure, where only a few people can handle certain issues. Unfortunately, this was the situation I found myself in. I was excited about this job because it involved working on social work systems, and coincidentally, my wife is a social worker. It seemed like a perfect fit for me. However, my excitement quickly turned into a nightmare. My role was to work on configuring a system called Liquid Logic, understanding its intricacies, and getting it up and running smoothly. Initially, I was under the impression that I was the best candidate for the job, but as soon as I started, my boss began micromanaging me and expressing persistent frustration because I didn't master the system in record time. My first few months on the job were not focused on configuring the new system as intended. Instead, I was tasked with supporting the old system because the person responsible for it fell ill and had to train me. This diversion from my actual role was frustrating, to say the least. Around the 4-month mark, a new team member joined, and discussions about contract extensions began. I naturally assumed this meant I'd be extended as well. However, just before going on medical leave for major surgery, my boss told me he wasn't pleased with my performance, which left me feeling demoralized and unsure about my future with the company. By this point, I had been told I was incompetent at my job, even though I'd only been doing it for a month, and the system I was working on was not widely used, making it challenging to find someone else with expertise. Nevertheless, I decided to dive deep into the system, conducting tests, collaborating with the testing team, and becoming a specialist in configuring pick lists. In fact, I became so proficient that people started coming to me for guidance on configuring pick lists. April rolled around, and I had been job hunting while continuing to work diligently. I informed my boss that I had secured a new job and would be resigning. That's when he realized something crucial: I was the only person who knew how to configure pick lists on the system. While I could teach others, it was a complex task, and I was also the only one familiar with the intricacies of the system, such as how to make specific case notes appear in certain places. My boss offered me an extension, but I had already been offered a 12-month contract elsewhere, so I declined. In stories like this, it's easy to cast people as heroes or villains, but the truth often lies in between. I may not have performed at my best initially, but given the unique and challenging nature of the system, I don't think anyone else would have fared much better. My boss had his quirks, like admitting he wasn't comfortable working with men, which was somewhat creepy, but at least he acknowledged it, even if not directly to me. He may not have treated me well, but I left with a very nice bottle of wine as a parting gift.
A few days ago, I found myself in a minor car accident, a situation that would soon take unexpected turns. It was a crisp afternoon, around 4:45, as I attempted a K-turn to exit a residential driveway onto a bustling street. In the process, I collided with a car that was zooming by, eager to overtake. The impact was startling, but luckily, no airbags deployed, and both vehicles remained drivable. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed a middle-aged father and mother inside the other vehicle, their toddler in a car seat by the door I had inadvertently struck. The family didn't speak English, which added a layer of complexity to the situation. The father, visibly shaken, immediately inspected the damage to his car, while his wife, still on the phone, presumably with the authorities, hurriedly sought assistance. Recognizing the need to clear the road, we moved into a nearby parking lot to await help. Time seemed to drag on, and about 20 minutes later, I retrieved their hubcap from the road and handed it to the concerned father. He opened the back door again, revealing a still sleeping baby. By now, it was approximately 5:40, and the situation was growing increasingly tense. At around 5:40, the couple's niece and her boyfriend arrived on the scene, their arrival heralding a shift in the dynamics of the accident. They immediately began insisting on monetary compensation to repair the vehicles, but I firmly insisted that we should go through insurance, as I simply couldn't afford to cover the costs of both cars. The niece repeatedly questioned my decision, hinting at alternative arrangements, and finally, she made an unexpected move by calling the police herself. While waiting for the authorities, tensions escalated further. It was now about 6:15 when the toddler finally woke up, crying and hungry after having been asleep for over an hour. The situation was growing increasingly complicated. At last, around 6:30, the police arrived, questioning the niece about the baby's condition. To my astonishment, she began to fabricate a narrative, falsely claiming that the child had been crying incessantly since the accident, urging the officers to call paramedics. A sinking feeling of suspicion gnawed at me. I had been involved in accidents before, and something about this situation just didn't add up. With a hunch that I was caught up in an insurance scam, I decided to check my dashcam footage. To my relief, it revealed a crucial piece of evidence. The car that had collided with me had sped through a red light just before the driveway where I had turned. When the police officer approached me for my side of the story, I calmly recounted the events and presented the dashcam footage, demonstrating that the traffic light had indeed been red in the direction from which they claimed to be coming. Wanting to set the record straight, I added another crucial detail: the baby had only started crying about 15 minutes before the police arrived. This revelation sent the niece into a furious tirade, hurling insults and accusations at me. Calmly, I informed the officer that my dashcam had recorded the exact moment the child woke up. Turning to the niece, the police officer sternly warned, "Ma'am, lying on a police report is a crime. Was the baby crying since the accident?" Suddenly, her confidence wavered, and she replied that she needed to consult with her aunt and uncle. In the end, she withdrew her claim, and the officer dismissed her so-called witness statement as it had no basis in reality. The truth had prevailed, and justice was served, unveiling the layers of deceit that had initially clouded this seemingly straightforward car accident.
Years ago, in a job I've long moved on from in a state where I no longer reside, I found myself caught up in a tale that still brings a triumphant grin to my face. Back then, I toiled away in the labyrinthine offices of a mammoth medical insurance provider, an establishment hell-bent on forging a sacred bond between individuals and their well-being. Office life, as it often is, was peppered with morale-boosting events, the typical fare of pizza parties and potlucks. On one fateful winter day, we decided to thaw our spirits with a chili cook-off. Now, most viewed these events as an excuse to abandon their work duties, but I, dear reader, am cut from a different cloth. A relentless competitive spirit and a dash of culinary prowess compelled me to see this as an opportunity to flex my culinary muscles. When the cook-off day arrived, I presented my masterpiece, among a dozen others. A trio of impartial judges within the office, not affiliated with the usual office clique, would determine the winner. Attendees could purchase a ticket to sample the offerings, effectively solving their lunch predicament. By the end of the event, my chili pot was the only one emptied, leaving the judges inquisitive and the office buzzing with admiration. But here's the twist: I didn't win. Now, let me preface this by saying that I had ruffled the feathers of the office clique before. I've never been one for politics, and I had a low tolerance for those who shirked their responsibilities, believing that their tasks were somebody else's burden. I've always been a proponent of teamwork, the philosophy that we can accomplish more when we all contribute, much like the Amish community moving a barn. It soon became evident that the birds of the office, predictable in their nature, didn't want yours truly to claim victory. Instead, they handed the title to someone who had, regrettably, earned the nickname Canned Chili. But patience, my dear friend, is a virtue I possess in abundance. I knew my chance for revenge would come, for the birds had two undeniable traits: predictability and greed. They yearned for more free food, paired with the opportunity to shirk their responsibilities. They couldn't resist another event, so they approached me, asking if I would participate. Oh, how I wanted revenge! They had robbed me as if I were a mere novice. I knew that this time, I wouldn't just compete for victory, I would wage a spicy, fiery war. For days, I scoured every grocery store I could find, accumulating a fiery arsenal of hot peppers, no reapers, though this was Minnesota in the dead of winter. I also concocted secret ingredients that would double down on the spice, ensuring the birds would pay dearly. Understand, I wasn't trying to poison anyone. Everything I prepared was edible, and dare I say, exceptionally delicious. This time, I went with chicken and employed thick-cut, smoky bacon from the local butcher. This batch of chili set me back about $75, but it was worth every penny. Game day arrived, and while there were several other competitors, not as many showed up as last time. A close friend had talked up his own recipe, so we did a little cross-promotion sneak preview. His face turned beet red, and he sweated profusely after tasting my chili. It was evident that I was in for a delightful time. As the event unfolded, the atmosphere became increasingly interesting. Sniffles, dabbed tissues, and desperate fans were now a part of the scene in the middle of a Minnesota winter, no less. But then, the birds arrived. I carefully avoided drawing attention to myself, stepping away to give them a chance to sample the spice that would soon wreak havoc. The moment I heard that first H-O-O-O, I knew I had them. The rest of the birds weren't far behind, feeling the fiery consequences of their gluttony. Soon, the judges approached, inquiring about my recipe. The truth was, I never had a set recipe. Cooking, in my eyes, was an art, not a science. I played it by ear, adapting and experimenting. I couldn't tell the judge that he was an unintended victim in my revenge plot, so I just nodded as he teared up, proclaiming my chili as the hottest thing he'd ever eaten, undeniably delicious but blisteringly spicy. In the afternoon, an email arrived, shorter than the usual winner's announcement. I had been declared the victor. While I'd like to think it was because my chili was superior, and I genuinely believe it was, I'm reasonably sure it was fear that clinched it. The Walmart gift card I received hardly covered half the cost of the chili pot, which, once again, was scraped clean. And as for how bad Montezuma was with his revenge, I can only imagine that he would have been impressed by my spicy retribution.
In the military, there's an unspoken rule. Your weapon should be spotless when you turn it into the armorer. This rule varies in strictness depending on who's inspecting it. And in my case, I had the pleasure of dealing with one of the most meticulous, OCD, and generally unpleasant armorers the military had to offer. But here's the catch, I'm not one to back down from a challenge, and I happen to be a master at cleaning and maintaining firearms. I knew the routine. Clean your weapon, turn it in, and if it's up to snuff, the armorer will accept it. If not, it's back to the cleaning station for you. This particular armorer, though, took things to a whole new level. If he found even a speck of spent powder, he'd kick it back to you. So naturally, when he kicked it back to me, I was annoyed but not deterred. I cleaned that rifle until it was sparkling, even cleaner than the day it left the factory. But still, he kicked it back. Frustration was building, and I was beginning to suspect that this was more about his personality than the cleanliness of my weapon. So, I tried again, and once again, he rejected it. At this point, I was seething. There was absolutely nothing more I could do to that rifle to make it cleaner. It was time to teach him a lesson. But instead of retaliating immediately, I decided to play the long game. I knew that in about a month, we'd have a field training exercise, and the armorer would be joining us. So, for that entire month, I was as sweet as honey whenever I interacted with him. Yes, specialist, no, specialist, whatever you say, specialist. I knew this would make him think we were friendly and that he could take advantage of our newfound camaraderie. Fast forward to the field training exercise, and my plan was in full swing. The armorer treated me like his personal errand boy, but I played along. This was all part of a bigger plan, and I could be patient when revenge was on the horizon. On the third day of our field training, an opportunity presented itself that I couldn't resist. I noticed that the armorer had left his rifle unattended, a major no-no in the military, and one that could lead to creative punishments. This was my moment. I moved the armorer's rifle, concealing it under a pile of equipment in a transport van that he had been leaning against. I left just a bit of the stock sticking out, enough to make it look like it had been casually laid there and buried under other gear. As the day wore on, the tension built. We had a crucial training exercise scheduled for the late afternoon, and it would be a shame if a certain someone didn't have his rifle for it, especially when our first sergeant was known for his no-nonsense approach. As expected, the armorer's rifle was declared missing during the gear check. First Sergeant exploded with anger, using colorful language to express his frustration. It was a sight to behold, and I knew this was just the beginning of my revenge. But I stayed quiet, not wanting to give away my involvement or get caught up in the fury of the situation. First Sergeant grew tired of yelling and switched to physical punishment, a military practice known as a smoking. The training exercise was canceled, and the armorer was to be smoked until someone from his platoon found the missing rifle. I was among those tasked with locating it, and I pretended to search diligently, knowing that I had orchestrated this situation. We dragged out the search, watching the armorer struggle with exhaustion and frustration. Most people half-heartedly looked, as they weren't exactly fond of him either. After about 45 minutes, I decided that enough was enough. I retrieved the hidden rifle from the van and strolled casually over to First Sergeant. He asked the armorer to recite the serial number to confirm it was his rifle, which he did, confirming it. The armorer was finally allowed to recover his weapon, and the ordeal came to an end. Did he ever find out who hid his rifle? I'm not entirely sure. Did his attitude change after that incident? Perhaps just a bit. He remained sour for the rest of the training, but when it came to accepting weapons back into the armory after exercises, he seemed to have learned his lesson. In the end, my brilliantly petty act of revenge had been executed flawlessly, and I couldn't help but revel in the satisfaction of teaching a lesson to someone who deserved it.
In the bustling world of college life, I found myself working at a pizza shop, where I crossed paths with Sarah, a woman whose knack for stirring drama was rivaled only by her vindictiveness. She had a penchant for targeting coworkers and subjecting them to relentless bullying, with the ultimate goal of driving them to quit. In our college town, students could receive welfare support if their parents' income fell below a specific threshold. Unfortunately, I fell into a peculiar gray area, technically ineligible for student support due to my parents' income, despite receiving no financial help from them. Desperate to keep my job and support myself through college, I clung to this employment lifeline. One fateful day, Matt, a new hire, succumbed to Sarah's relentless harassment and decided to quit. It didn't take long for Sarah's malevolent gaze to shift onto me. She embarked on a campaign of torment that included slanderous lies, shouting with unwarranted hostility, neglecting to warn me of hot pans, a cardinal sin in kitchen jobs, and even conspiring with her friends to falsely accuse me of slacking off. Strangely, these accusations only surfaced after Matt's departure. The toll on my well-being was immense. My hours were cut, leaving me struggling financially and mentally. The weight of rent and college expenses pressed down on me like a heavy anchor, threatening to drag me under. What made matters worse was that Sarah, despite her employment at the pizza shop, was illegally claiming student welfare support meant for the unemployed. It was a deceitful act that could jeopardize her future as a lawyer, as the legal profession demands impeccable integrity. Any allegations of misconduct or fraud during one's college years could result in a permanent disqualification from practicing law. A tipping point arrived when I discovered an anonymous complaints line for welfare fraud. While most reports went unnoticed, I decided to take a chance. I provided precise details about Sarah's workplace, her work schedule, and her personal information. It was a risky move, but my desperation fueled my determination. To my surprise, the welfare department acted on my tip. Officials arrived at our pizza shop, citing multiple complaints against Sarah. While they may not have had a warrant, my boss opted to cooperate fully, displaying every inch of the CCTV footage. Perhaps he wanted to wash his hands of the situation or believed it was the right thing to do. Sarah, however, was not as savvy as her aspirations to become a lawyer might suggest. Panic-stricken, she confessed to her fraudulent actions during questioning. It was a stunning turn of events, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. A law student should have known better than to self-incriminate. In the end, Sarah received a suspended sentence, a blemish on her record that would likely thwart her dreams of becoming a lawyer. Defeated, she dropped out of college, while I persisted at the pizza shop. I persevered through the hardships, ultimately graduating with an associate's degree. Today, I have an all-right job, a far cry from those tumultuous days in the pizza shop, and I can't help but reflect on the karmic twist that brought justice to a chaotic chapter of my life. In the quaint town of Hollowsville, nestled deep within a dense forest, stood the ominous and ancient mansion known as Harrington House. Whispered legends surrounded the foreboding structure, tales of curses, malevolent spirits, and unavenged wrongs. Each Halloween, the daring locals dared one another to step foot inside, convinced that the souls trapped within sought revenge. One fateful Halloween night, a fearless group of teenagers led by Jake, the notorious troublemaker, gathered their courage to break into Harrington House. They scoffed at the ominous rumors, determined to prove their bravery in the face of the unknown. With trembling hands and flashlights held firmly, they crossed the threshold into the mansion's dark and decrepit interior. Unbeknownst to Jake's friends, he harbored a deep-seated vendetta against the group. They had played a Halloween prank on him not long ago, an elaborate scheme that had left him mortified and humiliated in front of the entire town. While they laughed it off as a harmless prank, Jake had been nursing his anger, plotting the perfect revenge. As the group ventured deeper into the mansion's dimly lit corridors, inexplicable events began to unfold. Ghostly whispers floated through the air, the temperature plummeted, and an oppressive atmosphere bore down upon them. The walls seemed to close in, and eerie shadows danced menacingly on the walls. Fear crawled up their spines. The climax of their harrowing journey came when they entered the mansion's grand, cobweb-laden dining hall. Amid the flickering candlelight, they stumbled upon an ancient family portrait of the Harringtons, the original inhabitants of the mansion. The patriarch's menacing glare in the portrait bore an uncanny resemblance to Jake himself. In a chilling twist of fate, the mansion's doors suddenly slammed shut, imprisoning them within its sinister walls. Panic gripped the group as they realized they were not alone. They were surrounded by vengeful spirits, awakened by the reckless intrusion. While Jake's friends suffered from personal nightmares and torment, haunted by their deepest fears and regrets, Jake himself watched in terror. He was powerless to stop the relentless spirits and their sinister retribution. The spirits finally turned their attention to Jake, unveiling their true intentions. They had been aware of his revenge plot and were determined to make him pay for his malevolence. Dragging him into a nightmarish realm of his own making, they manifested his past misdeeds and guilt into haunting, grotesque forms. In his own living nightmare, Jake faced his darkest fears and regrets, drowning in a sea of guilt and remorse. He pleaded for mercy, promising to make amends for his actions, and begged for release. The spirits relented, but not before leaving an indelible mark on his soul, a chilling reminder of the dire consequences of revenge. As dawn broke, the terrified teenagers fled Harrington House, forever changed by their night of unspeakable horror. Jake, in particular, had learned a haunting lesson about revenge. From that day forward, he dedicated his life to doing good and seeking forgiveness for his past transgressions. He lived with the knowledge that some ghosts never forget, and some curses never truly fade away, forever haunted by the memory of Harrington House.
On what seemed like a typical Monday at the tech support office, I sat in my cubicle, engaging in the familiar routine of browsing Reddit threads, listening to vaporwave tunes, and taking customer calls. The morning had been surprisingly calm, with only a few cases in the queue, and the gloomy clouds outside hinted at a potentially peaceful day. Little did I know, everything was about to change. My peaceful day took an unexpected turn when my cell phone began to ring loudly in my pocket. I hastily retrieved it, glancing at the screen to find an unfamiliar local number. With the hopes that it might be the AT&T installer I was expecting, I swiped to answer. However, instead of the expected voice on the other end, all I heard was giggling. And not just any giggling, but the laughter of preteen girls. I frowned, perplexed by how they had acquired my number, but I stayed on the line. "Hello?" I ventured, my confusion growing. The laughter continued, making it hard to discern any coherent words. "Who is this?" I asked, my patience waning. "Hi 3I," came the response amid the giggles, "I'd like to order a pizza." I sighed internally, realizing this was likely a prank. "Sorry, you've got the wrong number," I replied, rolling my eyes, and hung up. I placed my phone back on the desk, hoping to return to my Reddit browsing. Just 2 minutes later, my phone chimed again, and I saw the same number on the screen. Annoyance crept in as I picked up, only to be greeted with a raucous, "What's up, motherfucker?" The giggling in the background was even louder this time. I decided to cut them off abruptly and disconnected the call. 5 minutes elapsed before the same number flashed across my screen once more. My irritation grew, and I answered the call more sharply this time, demanding, "What do you want?" However, this time, it was a young boy's voice that greeted me. He sounded about 11 years old and appeared to be genuinely apologetic. "Hey, sorry about all the phone calls," he began. "My friends thought it would be funny to steal my phone and prank call random numbers. I'm really sorry they were annoying you." I felt a twinge of empathy for this kid, remembering my own mischievous antics at his age. "That's okay, buddy," I replied, the irritation dissipating. "Just make sure they don't do it again. Thanks for calling back to apologize, it means a lot." He expressed his gratitude, and we both hung up, feeling a bit better about the situation. Just when I believed the ordeal was over, my phone rang again. This time, it was from a different unfamiliar number. I picked up, only to find the same girl on the line, carrying on with their tiresome prank. Fed up, I scolded them angrily and ended the call. Enough was enough. I decided to play my hand and teach them a lesson. Waiting for about 10 minutes, I composed a text message to the prankster's number, a devious grin on my face. "I have contacted the local police and given them your number upon claims of phone harassment. They are tracing the calls to your location. Expect to see them soon." Of course, I had no intention of actually calling the police, I just wanted to scare them into never prank calling random numbers again. Approximately 2 hours later, I received a message from the prankster apologizing for their actions. I chose not to respond, allowing them to ponder the uncertainty of whether or not I had truly involved the authorities. My petty revenge had served its purpose, and I had successfully put an end to their pranks.
During my summer internship at a food company in Keokuk, Iowa, I was lodged in the local college dorm, which had once been a retirement home. It featured individual rooms and bathrooms, but there was one sizable commercial kitchen for all to share. The college had no summer program, but 2 fall students were allowed to move in early. One was rarely present, but the other treated the place like a party venue, often hosting a crowd of friends. The shared kitchen arrangement meant we all stored our food there, with the unspoken rule that we didn't help ourselves to what belonged to others. However, from the beginning, I noticed food items vanishing or getting consumed without permission, sodas and empty cereal boxes left to deceive. Frustrated, I posted a polite sign on the fridge, requesting everyone to respect each other's food. I also discussed the issue with both students, especially after the sign was up. Regrettably, the thefts continued, especially when I was away for the weekend. Frustrated and seeking a solution, I turned to my manager at work. Together, we concocted a plan for some pro-level revenge. My role in R&D involved working on food products, and I frequently needed various ingredient samples for developing new recipes. My manager had an ingenious idea: capsaicin extracts for my research, even though we weren't currently working on spicy flavor profiles. I found a supplier that could provide capsaicin extracts with different Scoville units, which measure spiciness. They sent me small 2-ounce bottles of 50K, 100K, and 250K Scoville extracts. I decided to go all out with the 250K extract. Mixing it with some water in a travel-sized spray bottle to create a potent solution, I donned gloves and a mask borrowed from work and set out to doctor the common food items that had been repeatedly stolen from the kitchen: cereal, chips, crackers, a jug of milk, and the lids of a few soda cans. I even put some of the extract in a separate bag, leaving it open to dry before carefully mixing it back into the original packaging. I conducted this covert operation in a different dorm room in my wing, well aware of how powerful this concoction could be in enclosed spaces. Upon completion of my spicy mission just before heading out of town again, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The anticipation of the inevitable outcome lingered in the air, and I knew I might never witness the results. With a mischievous grin, I left the doctored snacks to be discovered by the unsuspecting culprits. Upon my return, I entered the shared kitchen with a sense of curiosity. The room, once a source of annoyance and frustration, now felt strangely different. I noticed that some of the chips and cereal had vanished, along with 2 of the 3 cans of soda I had meticulously altered. No one had mentioned a word about the peculiar incident, and none of my food ever went missing for the remaining month of my stay. The silence was almost poetic, like an unspoken agreement that our shared space was to be respected. I hope that, as time passed, the culprits reflected on the unusual and fiery experience they had endured. Perhaps they came to appreciate the importance of respecting others' belongings and learned a lesson they'd carry with them for a long time, a memory of the day they had, quite literally, played with fire.
My boss wasn't exactly my favorite person. I was fresh into my career as a junior counsel, and the firm had assigned me to him for training on becoming a litigator. There were several reasons I didn't like him. First, his legal knowledge was questionable, and his writing skills weren't up to par for a litigator. For someone in our field, this was a big problem. Secondly, he lacked the confidence to appear in court. I could hardly believe it when he got jittery during a routine assignment court appearance, which is essentially just for setting trial dates. So, when he told me, "This opinion is no good," I was perplexed. I was sure I'd followed his instructions to the letter. When I reviewed the memo he'd emailed me 2 weeks earlier, it turned out that my work was exactly what he'd requested. I had a hunch about what was going on. He planned to delete my work, pass it off as his own, and leave me short on my docketing quota for the month. He'd pulled this stunt before. I knew that my memo would mysteriously land on a partner's desk without my name on it, thanks to my tech savviness and some less than stellar security at our firm. My boss was the embodiment of the young, wealthy city lawyer. Always impeccably dressed, he was on the fast track to becoming a partner. I, on the other hand, was still finding my footing. Maybe he thought it was easy to take advantage of me, but he was sorely mistaken. I couldn't stand my billable hours getting messed with, especially when I was already in hot water as one of the juniors who wasn't docketing enough, and our team's head partner was giving me a hard time. Complaining to the partner didn't do me any good. It felt like being back in school with a black eye and the principal shrugging it off as boys being boys. I couldn't work any harder. I was already doing the standard 6 days a week that city lawyers endure. But I could work smarter. So, one night, I came up with a plan, timed for Christmas. My gift to my boss was a memo delivered to his desk on December 24th. This memo seemed to come from the partner he reported to, who preferred old-school paper over emails. I'd meticulously crafted the memo to make it look genuine, even though my boss retyped it with an assignment from him to me instead. The task was a doozy, diving deep into admiralty law, its link to common law, and a constitutional division of powers question. I acted reluctant, questioning the urgency of this massive assignment since I was heading away for the holidays. But I knew the urgency was a key point in the memo, and with the partner conveniently on vacation, my boss couldn't verify. He was stumped, leaving me with the daunting task. However, I'd already written a similar paper for a third-year course, which made the work a breeze. I'd found the old draft on a floppy disk, made some tweaks, and voila! A lengthy memo on obscure Admiralty law with references tracing back to Lord Coke's era was ready. I did all this while making it seem like I was on holiday, albeit a modest one, with visits to my family. The holiday season ended, and I was back in my cramped cubicle, buried in work. My boss, sporting his finest suit and gold accessories, approached me. "Where's that memo?" "I needed it when I returned today for a noon meeting." "Just finished it this morning," I replied, handing him the freshly printed memo. My boss took it, felt its weight, and walked away without a word. Shortly before lunch, a commotion echoed down the hallway. It was a rather loud affair, featuring a sudden expletive. The partner was on a tirade, summoning my boss to his office immediately. I had a front row seat to my boss's dash down the corridor. The partner questioned the authenticity of the memo, holding it at arm's length as if it were contaminated. My boss mumbled an explanation, and they disappeared into the office. Shouting, excuses, and more shouting followed. Then the office door flew open. "Called in the 90s, get in here," the partner barked, and I rushed in. "Did you write this memo?" the partner asked, passing it to me. I examined it. "Yes, I wrote it." The cover page was changed to remove my name, but aside from that, it's my work. I spent my entire Christmas working on it. "Is there an issue?" The partner exploded. "An issue? This memo is utterly useless, a total waste of time." I defended myself, explaining that I'd followed my boss's instructions and docketed over 100 hours for it. The partner couldn't contain his anger and ordered me to fetch the memo from my boss. I handed it over, and when he read it, his face turned red. He then dismissed me, and I quickly left. I didn't hear the full extent of my boss's scolding, but through office whispers, I learned that the partners were livid that my boss had squandered over 100 hours of a junior's time on a senseless task, an obvious prank. How he hadn't realized it was a prank was beyond them. I, however, escaped blame since I'd been working under his close supervision. My boss didn't get fired, but some positive outcomes emerged for me. The partner instructed me to send him copies of any memos I wrote for my boss, ensuring he couldn't take credit for my work. My boss also stopped deleting my dockets for research, and I even received a belated Christmas bonus for sacrificing my holiday to write that memo. I may have loathed working there, but whenever times got tough, I'd reminisce about the case of the forged memo, always bringing a smile to my face.
Let's call him Joe. We need a pseudonym for the man at the center of this tale, a man whose life I altered significantly. Let's go with Joe. Joe had a dark history, marked by domestic abuse. I was brought into this situation by Joe's brother-in-law, who happened to be the sibling of the woman Joe had abused. But it wasn't just a personal vendetta that drove me, there were serious business matters at stake. My client had substantial grievances against Joe, and we decided to settle these disputes in a court of law. The courtroom became our battleground, and Joe, armed with lies and bravado, was determined to prevail. His track record of using deception to escape consequences had given him a false sense of invincibility. It had worked before, notably in his divorce, where he had cleverly dodged child support payments. He might have assumed that a similar approach could win the day, but he couldn't have been more mistaken. The trial concluded with a judgment against Joe, a substantial one he couldn't possibly satisfy. Joe tried every trick in the book, twisting and turning, hoping to outmaneuver me. He believed he could rely on the same deceptions that had served him well in the past. Unfortunately for Joe, I was relentless. With unwavering determination, I uncovered and seized his assets. Joe's lack of foresight worked to my advantage. My clients were known for lawyering up early, leaving their adversaries in a precarious position. But Joe delayed, only consulting an attorney when the process server tossed legal papers at his feet. By then, it was already too late. I methodically picked away at Joe's assets until he had just one property left, a rented house that provided his sole source of income. Joe was forced to live in the basement while relying on rent checks from the upstairs tenants. He had to cash these checks at payday loan outlets, incurring hefty fees, because he knew that any bank account he opened would be garnished. For a while, Joe managed to keep his rental property hidden from me by owning it through a numbered company. But my investigator eventually uncovered it, tracking Joe to his home. The legal battles continued, with Joe representing himself. It was a tedious process that spanned years. I pierced through Joe's corporate veils and exposed his fraudulent conveyance attempts. Ultimately, the house he occupied became mine when the sheriff changed the locks while Joe was away. Can my client at least live in the basement? Joe's pro bono lawyer inquired, as Joe had no means to pay for legal representation by this point. The pro bono lawyer was someone I knew, working in a nearby office, and I could see his window across the parking lot from my high-rise. Ask the new owner, it's beyond my control, I replied. I informed Joe's lawyer that the new owner, one of my client's employees acting as a nominee, wouldn't allow him back into the basement. Joe had lost the last thing he owned on this earth, except for his truck, a massive, gas-guzzling vehicle that had become his makeshift home. Despite the situation, I allowed Joe to keep his truck because it was too old and frail to be of any value for asset seizure. But Joe's world came crashing down when he made a critical error and lost even his truck. The catalyst was a phone call from the tenants at the house Joe used to own. He came back and parked his truck across the driveway, the tenant informed me. Joe, driven by spite and anger, had obstructed the driveway with his truck and left for town, planning to return later to sleep in his vehicle. Can you maneuver around the truck? I asked. The tenant couldn't. The driveway was blocked. I reached out to one of the tow truck operators I had defended during my days as a criminal lawyer, and in a matter of hours, Joe's truck was relocated according to my specific instructions. The owner wants his truck back, the pro bono lawyer pleaded the next day when he called me. That's not happening, I stated firmly, standing in my office 15 floors above the parking lot, pondering that my pro bono counterpart was likely in his office, gazing at the same scene. But you have no right to the truck, he argued. He has no right to obstruct a man's driveway, I retorted. The power I wielded was undeniable, but it weighed heavily on my conscience as I pronounced words that stripped a man of his final earthly possession. It was like having the power of a god before consigning a man to destitution. Are you really going to make me go to court over this? Inquired the pro bono lawyer. Do what you must, I replied, unshaken. The next morning was bright and sunny. As I gazed out my window at 9 a.m, sipping my coffee, the phone rang. I picked up. It was the pro bono lawyer. Why didn't you inform me that Joe's truck was parked right outside my office? His voice was taut, revealing his simmering anger. Is that so? I said, peering at Joe's truck parked 15 stories below me. How careless of my bailiff to leave the truck within your client's reach. I must speak to him about it. Very amusing. My client intends to sue. No, he won't. He's going to get in his truck and drive away, right now. I instructed my tow guy to fill up the tank and provide an oil change, gratis. Advise your client to enter his truck and leave. If I ever see that truck again, I will seize it to satisfy the remainder of my client's judgment. Despite his attempts to argue, I stood my ground. Then I hung up and picked up my coffee. A few minutes later, Joe walked out of his lawyer's office, heading toward his truck. I watched him from above and noticed that he had lost his spring in his step. The jubilance had faded. Joe wasn't the first person I had brought down, and he wouldn't be the last, but he was the only one whose ultimate downfall I witnessed from my office, a viewpoint of immense power. I watched as he walked to his truck, cognizant that I had stripped him of every possession, leaving him solely with the truck, and even that, he owed to my leniency. Joe drove away, his large, aging truck emitting plumes of exhaust smoke. I was fairly certain I would never hear from him again, and I never did.
Desperation led me to seek a new job after my husband and I both lost our previous ones last year. I knew this new role was a step down from my previous position, but the manager and the team appeared promising, or so I thought. The scenario changed once I met my new manager, Gary, who was incredibly busy. he delegated most of his responsibilities to another manager, Jane. Originally, my role was supposed to act as a liaison between my team and Jane's, but things took a sour turn. Jane started micromanaging me, pushing me to work through lunch, change or cancel vacation days, calling me at unreasonable hours, and giving orders during phone calls. She even went so far as to make hurtful comments about my weight and claimed I was larger than others of my race. The list of personal slights was shockingly extensive. I began to stand up to her, which only made matters worse. The only reason I stayed was because I had bills to pay. But then, I reached my breaking point. On one Friday afternoon, after Jane yelled at me for a minor issue concerning a meeting, I had a mental breakdown. I was already grappling with a family tragedy and couldn't handle it anymore. I confided in Gary about the ordeal with Jane, and he was sympathetic, not at all surprised, especially considering that half of her team had already quit. He offered to move me to a different team under his management, which I gladly accepted. But my relief was short-lived. Jane continued to boss me around from a distance, and when I started ignoring her emails, she showed up at my desk one day, loudly belittling me and questioning my qualifications. Gary overheard and reprimanded her, but the verbal abuse persisted. After 2 months, I couldn't take it any longer. I abruptly drafted my resignation letter and attached the list of Jane's offensive comments, copying everyone involved. Although Gary offered multiple accommodations to keep me, I insisted that the only way I would stay was if Jane was gone. Regrettably, he didn't have the authority to fire her, as her manager was in a different country. Despite multiple HR complaints from at least 5 people, no action was taken. So, I left, unapologetically explaining my reasons to everyone. Life became extremely tough for the next 3 months. There were nights when we had nothing but slices of bread, struggling to pay the mortgage and cover emergency expenses due to health issues and a funeral. Even after my husband found a job, we were still trying to catch up on bills. I spent months applying to numerous jobs daily. Last month, I came across a public memo announcing a former colleague was joining the company I had recently left. We used to work closely together, so I sent him a congratulatory message, offering insights into the new workplace. After a quick conversation, he invited me to join his team as his chief of staff, and I accepted. Jane's surprise was evident when we had our first all-hands call. In the Big Shot's introductory speech, he mentioned that I would be his chief of staff. I now sat 2 levels above Jane, and it turned out that within the 3 months I was away, the other half of her team had also left. Every single person had resigned. Gary was delighted for me and had only kind words. On the other hand, Jane opted for an inappropriate approach and sent a negative email to the Big Shot, calling me unqualified and making baseless accusations. The Big Shot forwarded me her email, seeking an explanation. My nerves and excitement were both running high. Unbeknownst to Jane, I had been a director at a rival company of the Big Shot's, and I already held a position higher than hers. A 2-level jump wasn't substantial. I had worked with him for 5 years and was more than happy to share my perspective. In a 1-hour conversation with the Big Shot, I emphasized that Jane was detrimental to the company's culture and provided evidence in the form of confirmation from Gary regarding her team's high turnover. I also mentioned my previous resignation letter, which was still on my desktop when I returned, along with several other rude emails she had sent to her recent staff. They were more than willing to share these with us. Finally, the Big Shot decided to fire Jane on a Friday.